Thank you very much, and thank you to Sister Teresa for the invitation. I should say at start that I'm not a Soloviev expert at all, and many of you will know in much more detail the inside of Soloviev's arguments. We've already heard some of that. What I am is I am a philosophical theologian. I'm particularly interested in the tradition running from Hegel to Heidegger and their critics, and within that with particular interests in existentialism and also in Russian and Jewish thought as part of that. Even though I'm not an expert on Soloviev, I immediately accepted the invitation because I am currently writing a book with the title The Metaphysics of Love. So it seemed like an offer I couldn't refuse, and I hoped I'd learn something about Soloviev as well. So what I want to say within my perspective is why I think Soloviev is important for the intellectual tradition, the intellectual theological tradition that I'm engaged with. Because I'm speaking in English, I will try to speak a little bit slowly and clearly, but that might mean I run out of time at the end. I start, in fact, with the end of Dante's Commedia, a vision of God whom, in the last line, Dante describes as the love that moves the sun and other stars. As a whole, the Commedia is, of course, a poem about love, about the power of love, mediated through the heavenly intervention of Lucy, Beatrice, and Mary, and through their efforts, the sending of Virgil. This chain of heavenly love actually begins on earth, in that moment when young Dante saw and seeing fell in love with the 9-year-old Florentine girl, Beatrice. The story thus combines what we call romantic love and love of God. But the words, the last line I quoted, also shows Dante's view that this isn't only a human story and a divine story, but also a cosmic story. The power at work when Dante first fell in love, and the power that enables his transhumanized ascent through the heavenly spheres, is also the prime mover, the primus motor of Aristotle's physics, the power that directs the movements of the heavenly bodies that determine the structure of human beings' experiences of time and space. Once we realize this, we understand why Dante takes great pains to correlate the story, his spiritual journey, and the astronomical phenomena he sees on the way. The meaning of love is dovetailed into the physical structure of the universe. Now, all of this, of course, is done in the cosmology of Dante's own time, pre-Copernican and pre-Darwinian. Dante's universe is a self-enclosed whole, operating according to a cyclical pattern that rules out any radical change or development. This, at times, generates tensions with the historical perspective of the Bible. More immediately, it's also the cause of greatest difficulties for Dante's modern readers, for us. It's difficult because that cosmology is no longer ours, and we've lost the concepts and the vocabulary that help us make sense of it. Commentaries can, of course, help, but constantly having to look at footnotes destroys the pleasure of reading the poetry. So to understand Dante, do we have to demythologize him? Certainly we cannot believe in the cosmology that Dante believed in, Maybe some people in Kentucky do, I'm not sure. But I believe what he has to say about love does teach us that love must be embedded in some cosmology. Dantean love cannot be limited either to intellectual love nor to passionate love, but it belongs to and reveals the structure of how things are in the world, in the cosmos. So can Dante's vision be redescribed in such a way as to find a new home in the post-Copernican and evolutionary view of the universe and human life that we today inhabit? This challenge is more difficult than it appears, because it's not just a matter of exchanging one cosmology for another, because the very stability, continuity, and holistic character of the medieval worldview made it easier to argue for the role of love in the workings of the universe and to explain evil as parasitic upon an essentially amorous world. The challenge of the modern view is not only that it offers a more thorough account of the mechanism of cosmic development that doesn't seem to require any spiritual forces, but that evil and suffering seem integral to the process of evolution itself. Although writing before the publication of The Origin of the Species, the English poet Alfred Lord Tennyson made the point with a characteristic poetic precision when he wrote of nature that so careful of the type she seems, that is the species, so careless of the single life. In other words, development in nature happens only as the result of a colossal waste of individual forms and lives that never acquire a permanent place in the cosmic order. Not even if, like trilobites or dinosaurs, they have inhabited the earth for many millions of years, far longer than the human species, they're entirely dispensable. We too. So it's far harder for us than for our medieval forebears to formulate a concept of love that is not only divine and human, but that also integrates the best available understanding of the universe in which we live and move and have our being. A further difficulty is that science itself is still rapidly developing, and by the time that scientific research reaches philosophers and theologians, it's probably already out of date. Nevertheless, despite these difficulties, the hypothesis of this paper is that Vladimir Soloviev was a pioneer in attempting the development of a Christian interpretation of love that would be fully congruent with a modern evolutionary worldview, and that this attempt is still worth our attention. Some aspects of his thought are inevitably distinctively 19th century. Other aspects are distinctively Russian. Nevertheless, even though 20th century developments place significant question marks against parts of Soloviev's theory, not least his treatment of sex and his historical optimism, his work remains a major contribution to the task of preparing the way for a new Dante, which I think is what we really want. Personally, I happen to think that maybe Dostoevsky was that new Dante, but that's a whole other set of questions. I start by looking at Soloviev's inheritance from German idealism, insofar as this concerns the question of love, and then proceed to an account of his philosophy as love as a defining aspect of his concept of being human, and ending with some questions. Like other Russian religious philosophers of the 19th and 20th century, German idealism is an important part of the background of Soloviev's thought. Developing out of German Romanticism and trained in Christian theology, it's no surprise that Hegel conceived of the absolute as love. But what, according to Hegel, is love? The true essence of love, he writes, consists in renouncing the consciousness of oneself and forgetting oneself in another self. Yet in this passing away and forgetting, first having and possessing oneself. As Hegel continues, this mediation of the spirit with itself and its completion as totality is the absolute. Although, he goes on to add, this is a totality, a one, in which each of the parts retains its own identity as a spiritual personality. Taken as a whole, then, it seems that Hegel's system has the same goal as Dante's poem, namely to demonstrate the unity of divine, human, and cosmic love. However, Hegel's critics, since then, have found its actual working out in Hegel's own work inadequate. In the system as Hegel developed it, most commentators say, the whole triumphs at the expense of the parts. Abstraction and conceptualization win out over concreteness, idealism over materiality, eternity over time. All of these points are arguable, of course, but to the extent that Hegel's formulation, Hegel's project, if you like, is taken up by Soloviev, the Russian thinker's own specific tasks required him to give a more concrete and a more incarnational account of what the mediation of spiritual personality might involve. I shall not say anything now about Schelling, perhaps more immediately important for Soloviev than Hegel, but go on to a third figure of German idealism, Schopenhauer. In Schopenhauer, will has become everything, and the affirmation of spiritual personality is eclipsed. For Schopenhauer, the principle of individuation is the root of all evil. The failure to recognize that there is only one reality, one primordial will without motive, completely blind, is what compels us to see our individual interests as distinct from other people's interests and to cling on to our own individual lives in the face of an ineluctable death. Thus, for Schopenhauer, the only real ethical principle is compassion. Indeed, compassion is quite simply a consequence of recognizing the true nature of things, that the suffering we see in others is the same suffering as we experience in ourselves. There is only one life manifesting under conditions of individualization that lack ontological substance. However, as Soloviev comments on Schopenhauer's teaching from the Justification of the Good, the removal of barriers between the self and the not-self, or immediate identification, is merely a figure of speech and not an expression of real fact. Like the vibration of chords, musical chords, that sound in unison, so the bond of compassion between living beings is not simply identity, but harmony of the similar. For the indissoluble oneness of the world is not a mere empty unity, which he thinks it is in Schopenhauer, but embraces the whole range of determinate variations. And as he shortly afterwards adds, the true essence of pity or compassion is certainly not the immediate identification of oneself with another, but the recognition of the inherent worth of that other, the recognition of his right to existence and possible welfare. In this regard, Soloviev is closer to Hegel, or to Hegel's intentions, than he is to Schopenhauer, since, like Hegel, the affirmation of the spiritual personality of each individual other is integral to the unity of the whole in love. At the same time, Hegel's rationalism leaves Soloviev closer to Schopenhauer's insights into the immediate unity of life. Something like this, at least, is the dialectic that Soloviev is setting out to address. At the same time, he is, of course, writing 50 years later than the German idealists. In that time, there had been a massive expanse of natural science, including Darwin's account of the origin of species, which Hegel knew nothing about, of course. Now, sexual reproduction had already acquired a significance for Schopenhauer that is lacking in Hegel and Schelling, since on his view, it is sexual desire that is the most immediate manifestation of the will to life that is perpetually frustrated and is therefore the source of human unhappiness, an idea we also find in Tolstoy's late novels. Although Darwin was relatively uninterested in the psychological effect of the sexual act on individuals, the theory of evolution gives a central place to sexual reproduction as the means of transmitting the genetic variations that lead to the emergence of the new species. Sexuality is the organ, if you like, of what Richard Dawkins called the selfish gene. It's how it works. So if for the medievals, sex was the means by which God provided for the continuation of the human race, for Darwinism, it's the means by which we became human in the first place, which seems a small, but it's a very significant difference. In this context, it's striking that Soloviev does not approach sex as just one problem amongst others. In The Meaning of Love, even if he didn't like it very much, he said that sexual love is taken as the point of departure for the treatise as a whole. It is what has to be explained. Both in animals and humans, Soloviev writes, sexual love is the highest flowering of individual life. Now, of course, the image of flowering, as opposed to fruiting, suggests that it's not the ultimate goal of human life, but it is a necessary stage in the development towards it. Elsewhere, as in Justification of the Good, Soloviev strikes a more negative note when he speaks about the appropriateness of shame in relation to sex, when it's directed towards biological reproduction and therefore perpetuating the cycle of birth and death. But Schopenhauer's option of renunciation of sexual desire is not an option. Asceticism itself, Soloviev often points out, can be motivated by egoism, and the conquest of one's rebellious passions doesn't necessarily bring about love. Nor should we see this as just a matter of individual choice, because the sublimation, if you like, of sex is a development being prepared in the processes of cosmic and historical life. I quote, "How many geological and biological epochs passed away in unsuccessful attempts to create a brain qualified to become the organ for the embodiment of rational thought. Love is as yet for humans what reason was for the animal world. It exists in its beginnings or as an earnest of what will be, but not as yet in actual fact. In a modern cosmological perspective, the non-realization of love, in the course of a comparatively few thousand years experienced by historical humanity, and remember how many years, millions of years, trilobites and dinosaurs existed, but there aren't any anymore, so we've just been around for a very short time. 35,000 years of humans in Europe is nothing in evolutionary terms, so this doesn't give us a right to infer anything whatever against its future realization. We're just at the beginning. So in this way, Soloviev takes advantage of modern science in arguing for a spiritual conception of love. We're not faced, as it seemed to many in his time, with a simple binary choice between a materialist, reductionist explanation and a spiritual, perhaps dualistic view of love, but a dynamic and open model that allows for new possibilities to emerge, or at least come to view in the course of historical development. So how does this relate to our actual, concrete experiences of love? Dante's journey began when he saw this girl and fell in love with her somewhere in Florence. So how does Soloviev connect that type of experience with the ultimate vision of love as constitutive of a divine human cosmic all-unity? So I move on to some points from the meaning of love, which probably you know most of the next session anyway, but I'll say it nonetheless. Soloviev's view of being human has, I think, an essentially different starting point from that of most modern Western anthropologies, religious or secular. Like other Russian thinkers, Soloviev is fundamentally non-individualistic. We've seen that versus Schopenhauer, Soloviev does not regard the principle of individualization as simply an error. Like Hegel, he wants to assert the reality of a manifold of spiritual personalities, but this doesn't mean that the individual is the basic unit from which we have to develop an understanding of humanity. And that's the same whether we think of the individual as a thinking ego, with Descartes, a materialistically conceived center of physical desires, with Feuerbach, or a phenomenologically disclosed existential subject, with Sartre. Instead, being human is at its deepest, or even highest, ontological principle, a being in community. Fully to understand this point, we have to see humanity in the context of its divine nature and origin, specifically its relation to the world soul, which Soloviev also identifies with ideal humanity and Sophia, which, as he says, contains within itself and unites with itself all particular living entities or souls. As the realization of the divine principle, its image and likeness, archetypal humankind, or the world soul, is both one and all. As he continues, the world soul occupies a mediating position between the multiplicity of living entities which constitute the real content of its life, you and me and the trees outside, and the absolute unity of divinity, which is the ideal principle and norm of life. It's not to my purpose today to go deeply into his sophiology, other than to draw attention to how the threefold identification of Sophia, world soul, and archetypal humanity means that humanity is in its very principle manifold, a unity, to repeat, of all particular living entities or souls, intrinsically related to the multiplicity of living entities which constitute the real content of its life. All things are implicitly, passively, or potentially present in the world soul, and therefore also in humanity. But as Soloviev also explains, in humanity, this world soul is for the first time inwardly united with the divine Logos in consciousness as a pure form of all unity, which makes humanity the natural mediator between God and material being, the conductor of the all-uniting divine principle into elemental multiplicity, the orderer and organizer of the universe. The necessary and inherent manifold of archetypal humanity is repeated in the form of redeemed humanity. Salvation is not a matter of individuals being saved, as in Protestant revivalist rallies. Although Jesus Christ had to become incarnate as an individual human being in order to reach human beings in their actual material individuality, the redemption he made possible is more than individuality. Deification is not a grace given to some few exceptional saints. Deification is the destiny of humanity. I quote, "Since a human being can receive divinity only in his or her absolute wholeness, that is, in union with the all, the man-God is necessarily collective and universal, that is, all humankind, the universal church. The God-man is individual, whereas the man-God is universal." It is this promise of universalism, he says, is the gift of the Eastern Church to a West that has become isolated and helpless in its individualism. Plus ça change. We seem to have come a long way from sexual love, but we shall soon see how these are relevant. As popularly understood, including in the churches, the purpose of sexual love is for the procreation of children, ensuring the continuation of the human species. In some versions of this, there's a special role for what in English we call good breeding, whereby the sexual instinct brings together exceptional individuals capable of producing exceptional children who can benefit the human race as a whole. However, as Soloviev somewhat humorously remarks, neither the parents nor the descendants of Shakespeare or Columbus seem to have been at all remarkable or even remarkably passionate. In many cases, the experience of sexual passion between profound and exceptional individuals is so far from being beneficial to the human race as to end in suicide or tragedy, whilst in others great desire is simply unrequited. Divine providence, which the modern world also calls the will of the universe or the unconscious spirit, does assure an appropriate supply of great benefactors, but this doesn't necessarily involve love, an argument Soloviev also humorously illustrates by the genealogy of the Messiah according to the Bible. So sexual love can't be explained in utilitarian terms. There's no correlation between the energy invested in it and its outcomes on the plane of historical life. Yet, as we've heard, sexual love is the highest flowering of individual life. So what is this flowering? In the first place, we note that in humanity, individuality possesses an independent significance and cannot, in its most powerful expression, be merely an instrument of ends of the historical process external to it. This significance, its absolute worth, consists in the indubitable presence in the human being of the absolute form or image of rational consciousness. That could be Hegelian, but Soloviev's formulation, razumnie soznanie, is not the German Vernunft, and it comprises the speculative teaching regarding Sophia, world soul, archetypal humanity, and divine logos. Rationality here means consciousness of universality, of all truth, the positive unity of all. This capacity for apprehending universal truth is possessed by each individual human being. Each of us is potentially capable of understanding a universal law of nature or creating a work of art that will be of abiding significance to future generations and to other cultures. Yet at the same time, our individual relation to the universal is inhibited by virtue of our individuality. Because we are the animal individuals we are, as such, influenced by egoism. No escape from that. Our capacity for knowing truth, then, is in existential conflict with the egoism of our worldly nature, and without the intervention of a third power, seems irresolvable. So long as the living power of egoism in humans doesn't encounter another living power opposed to it, consciousness of the truth is only an external illumination, a reflection of an alien light, Soloviev writes. This other living power is, of course, love. Quote, love, as the actual abrogation of egoism, is the real justification and salvation of individuality. As Dante commented on how, when he first saw Beatrice, he saw a new God, more powerful than himself, by which he would from henceforth be ruled. So in principle, it's possible for us to recognize, of course, that all others have the same feelings, the same thoughts as ourselves. But in practice, that often doesn't make much difference. We continue in our egoistic ways. So love needs to have a powerful, immediate, if you like, almost physical form to break down our egoism, what he calls a chemical power. And this is made possible by the division of human beings into sexes. Now, I am going to have to skip some words here, but hopefully will be coherent. The problem, of course, with focusing on physical sexuality, this is, if you like, an advance, but it's also essentially, even in its normal forms, in family life, for example, not really different from what contemporary psychiatry then called fetishism. Because, like fetishism, the normal conception of sexuality takes the part for the whole. It just focuses on one form and not what that form is pointing to. And of course, for Soloviev, normal sexual love is pointing beyond itself to something else. Love is moved by and aims at the affirmation of the other person in their real individual integrity. If we also consider that from the divine point of view, all things are eternally united in an ontological unity, then really to know the individual is not only to know them in their individuality, not only in relation to that human love by which they're defined, but to affirm any individual being whatsoever in God means to affirm him not in his separateness, but in the all, in the unity of the all. So in the conclusion of his essay, Soloviev condenses this vision of love into the figure, a cosmic psyche, in which human beings are united to their social and their cosmic environment. This is a transformation or directing inward of that same creative power which in nature, being directed outward, produces the basic infinity of physical propagation of organisms. He concludes that this will sound hopelessly idealistic to many readers, but again the new cosmology comes to his help and he reaffirms that we are just at the beginning. Who knows where this will lead? I have some questions, but I think rather than make them, I will skip to a brief historical comment. I've spoken of Soloviev as a pioneer in attempting to think a holistic and spiritual view of love in the context of an evolutionary worldview. There are, of course, parallels. Amongst modern Protestant theologians, Paul Tillich spoke of love as the drive towards the reunion of the separated. As such, love integrates the manifold dimensions of life, including biological life and concrete social existence, and enables them to be drawn into a higher unity that in God is participation in the transcendent unity of unambiguous life. Of course, Tillich, like Soloviev, shared in Schelling an important intellectual thought, and beyond Schelling also Jacob Boehme. Teilhard de Chardin, who I don't think was influenced by either Boehme or Schelling, creator of perhaps the most original and spectacular vision of an evolutionary theology in the 20th century, for whom the whole process of evolution was the Christification of the universe, similarly saw love as the power by which matter is taken up into the inwardness of spiritual life, not as an individual ascetic achievement, but as a moment in the unification of humankind. Strikingly, though again drawing, I think, on different sources, Teilhard too figured the relationship between God and cosmos in terms of divine love for the eternal feminine, though the secondary literature on this discusses it mostly in relation to Bulgakov and not to Soloviev. That is the relation between Teilhard's eternal feminine and the concept of the eternal feminine in Russian thought. More generally, we can say that process theology, particularly influential in America in the 1960s and 70s, strikes many similar notes. Yet for all the good work that has been done, the questions that Soloviev raised, but left unanswered, remain unanswered, because they're questions that we must raise and answer for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much.